All right, let's talk about integrating evidence. Now that we kind of can visualize what a strong analytic paragraph looks like, let's talk about putting those quotations in there effectively. So when we are talking about citing for AP language, we want to use MLA format, which typically is author's last name and page number, the name and the like I said, page number in parentheticals. However, the only essay you need to do that for on your actual exam is the synthesis prompt. And in that case, you only have to include the author's last name or the source letter. It's very important for the synthesis prompt, but for rhetorical analysis, for example, you do not need to cite line numbers or anything like that because the passage is something the readers are very familiar with, and we know who the author is because it's always the same, okay? So let's talk about the first method for integrating evidence. This is probably the one you're most familiar with, and I call it the lead-in, and it's just basically using a phrase to kind of lead into that evidence. So you could say according to so-and-so, and then provide your quotation. So an example of I have below, it says, in his article, Johnson argues that too often young people are determined to defy the social expectations of their parents' generation. So there again, I start out with in his article, Johnson argues that, and then provide the quotation. And that's what I think is the most familiar way of integrating evidence, the lead-in. The next one is to paraphrase the evidence, which is just to put it in your own words while still maintaining some specific details. So I have a quotation from the novel Night, and an example of how you would paraphrase, the yellow star, oh well, what of it, you don't die of it, is in my example, which says, Ellie's father, for example, is not concerned about the yellow stars, assuring them that one cannot die from it. In this case, that detail of the yellow star is what makes it very specific. When we're thinking about paraphrasing, I should be able to point to the exact lines that you're paraphrasing or that you're referring to in a rhetorical analysis or a synthesis or whatever, so it needs to be very specific. And the third method is what I call the semi-paraphrase, and this is the one that I use most often and what I think more sophisticated writing uses because it creates such a beautiful fluency. But it's basically saying that you integrate the author's words and your own. So it's a combination of directly quoting and paraphrasing. So again, I have a quotation, but for my example, I've quoted the first part where it says, when Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone came out, and then I've paraphrased the rest, which says the genre of children's literature was a low priority for publishers. So I think a great way to kind of think of how to do a semi-paraphrase is if you have a quote picked out, choose part of it, half of it, that you can put in your own words and keep the rest the same. And you'll be able to kind of maintain your own voice in your writing. Because when we're talking about integrating evidence, the reason it matters and why we can't just drop a quotation in there with none of this lead-in, without paraphrase, semi-paraphrasing, is that it kind of interrupts your argument. Because when you write, I am hearing your voice as you're telling me about the author's purpose, the argument you're making, however it is. But if you just kind of drop a quote in there, it's very jarring because I'm pulled out of what you're saying to see what someone else is saying. So when we integrate that evidence using lead-ins or paraphrase or semi-paraphrase, it kind of creates a marriage between your voice and the voice of whoever you're citing. So we always want to make sure that we're using one of these methods. Again, just to go over them, like I said, the first one is that quick lead-in, putting something at the beginning to kind of transition into the evidence. There's the option of paraphrasing, and then semi-paraphrasing, which I think is probably most common in those upper level essays we will look at.